more that we see coming out of Israel, the more that we see what Hamas has really done here. The calling of Hamas the same as ISIS and treating them the same as ISIS seems very apropos. The latest stories of today involving finding babies beheaded. Not just one, multiples, children burned alive, whole families gunned down in their homes. This attack on Israel, which will get to over 1,000 people dead in Israel alone. The biggest thing that has happened in Israel in 50 years as a comparison piece. If you were to take the amount of dead based on Israel's population and extrapolate that out to the United States, it would be 24,600 people dead in one day. The question that remains is, how is it possible with all of Israel's advanced abilities and capabilities, never mind that of the United States, how did they not know this was coming? Welcome to the show, presented by Americans for Prosperity, americansforprosperity.org, economic liberty, free speech. That's where it's at. This is Glenn Reynolds. He is the instant pundit right there. You can find him and his site, pundit.com. A little bit of info, but nothing to work with. Let's talk about this failure. This incredible failure of the intelligence agencies and how it's right over at the New York Post. This has a warning, a serious warning for America's politicized agencies. We're talking about the IRS, the FBI, the CDC, all of it. Talk to me about first how you are looking at these intelligence failures, and then what's behind your head.
Sure. Well, it's like Americans are used to thinking of the Israeli intelligence agencies as super competent, and they have a pretty good track record, and they get good press. We have the Mossad, which is kind of their equivalent of the CIA, and we have Shin Bet is kind of their equivalent of the FBI. And, you know, Gaza is literally right next door. We assume they have a lot of spies in there and they're looking for stuff. So it's very shocking that such a massive military operation happened and they were completely caught flat-footed. It'll probably turn out when they look that, in fact, there were signs and things reported and noticed, but that nobody put them all together to figure out what was actually happening. I have read, my column, I speculated on this, and I've now since read that one thing that Hamas did was that they didn't use electronic communications. They met in person, they used couriers, you know, everything but carrier pigeons, and I can't rule those out, to avoid being hoovered up by all the electronic surveillance stuff that the United States and Israel have. But it's also the case that we've seen something very different in the Israeli intelligence community in the last 2 years, and something unfortunately kind of familiar, which is it's become quite politicized. The institutions of the Israeli government, like the institutions of most governments, lean left to a substantial degree. A lot of the people running, that's certainly true of the head of the Mossad, by the way, and the people running them really don't like Bibi Netanyahu. And particularly over the last year or so, when they should have been noticing all this stuff, they were violating Israeli law by organizing protests against Netanyahu and his plan for judicial reform. No. And I just think they were probably distracted. I think that, you know, when you're planning protests against the idea that the Supreme Court justices should be democratically chosen instead of having the Supreme Court choose itself, which is how it works there, I think you're not doing your job. And we see that in a lot of agencies in the United States. And most of them have done really bad jobs. The CDC got politicized and distracted.
We've seen it with Andrew McCabe. We've seen it with a host of people, Peter Strzok, Lisa Page. I want you to go back to this Mossad conversation just for a moment. Mossad was working in a way to get information regarding the judicial reforms, whether or not the court should change in Israel?
Yes.
They were doing it now. Like, what was the methodology?
They were organizing protests. They were sending people out to help the various lefty groups get organized and do stuff. Exactly how they did it and to what extent they used serious intelligence assets that they might normally use to stir up a protest crowd in an Arab country that they're opposed to, I don't know. But they unquestionably were spending a significant amount of time and effort supporting these protests, which is in violation of Israeli law. Like our CIA, they're not supposed to do anything domestically.
Now, you argue, and I think very effectively, in the New York Post, that this is exactly what happened. These alphabet agencies, at least in the United States, engage in what you refer to as mission creep. And why don't they help with this? And why don't they do something about this? And this is their purview. We mentioned some great examples about the CDC. I wanted to know where else you see this mission creep happening in the U.S., where they're not focused on the task at hand.
Well, of course, we see the FBI, which is our primary domestic counter-terror organization. What are they doing? Are they looking for Hamas agents? Not as far as we know, but we do know what they're doing in some sense. They're infiltrating traditional Catholic congregations. They had huge numbers of undercover people at the January 6th protest. For all we know, they had a majority of the people there. They won't say how many, and they act embarrassed when it comes up. They are arresting pro-lifers and designating parents who complain at school board meetings about trans policies as domestic terrorists. So that's where their emphasis appears to have been over the last few years. And that's despite the fact that we've had, at least according to some estimates I've seen, 5 million men of military age cross our border unaccounted for over the last few years. How many of them are Hamas or some other kind of terrorists? Probably a pretty small fraction, but a small fraction of 5 million is a lot of people.
And there are a lot of concerns about what kind of terrorism could be taking place here. Talking to Glenn Reynolds, he also runs Instapundit as well as being a law professor at the University of Tennessee. The taking the eye off all conversation, right? That comes up a lot. Taking the eye off the ball is the concern that we're going to not be paying attention to an attack because we're looking somewhere else, or is the concern that we don't want to be seen as ideologically unacceptable, bigoted, etc. We won't notice in a problem.
Well, I think it's some of both. I mean, I think one of the big concerns people is when you have a hard job, it's human nature to look for some easy jobs. I'm that way. When it's time for me to do some major chore around the house, suddenly I start tidying things up and fixing little things and finding little jobs to do to keep me busy that aren't nearly as hard as whatever I am putting off. You saw that with the CDC. It was created to deal with the pandemic. But pandemic preparation is a little boring when there's not an actual pandemic, and they like to have stuff to put in their press releases and keep busy. So they started looking at everything from playground safety to cigarette smoking to guns as a public health problem and so on. And when it came time to deal with an actual pandemic, that was, like they say, you had one job. That was their job. They were terrible. They did an awful job from the very beginning. They screwed up the testing. They screwed up the precautions. They lied. Their whole response was a disgrace. And I can't help but think that some of it is just that they were busy doing things other than their job for so long. But it's also true, the worst thing you can be in the U.S. government right now is some kind of a racist. I guess maybe transphobe is worse nowadays, but it's right up there. And just as we saw, the British police knew about the Rotherham sex abuse thing, and because it was being done by Pakistani Muslims, they didn't bust it because they were afraid of being called racist. And that's documented. There are memos to that effect, and people who testified about it. So I think there's some of that here. I think people feel that in this administration, if you're worried about Arab terrorists, you're going to be marked as politically unreliable. So I think that it's a lower priority.
But one would think when you see something of this magnitude as we have in Israel, it resets the mind, it resets the focus. Wait a second, maybe we need to do our job. But if the job is ideological and not national based, there's no chance.
I mean, I certainly hope that there are people at the FBI and elsewhere saying, one of the worst mass shootings we had in the United States was actually Muslim terrorists who came in across the borders. And that was only two people who did it. Maybe we should be worried about people coming over by the thousands. And maybe we should be focusing our intelligence gathering that way instead of spying on what's going on in traditional Catholic congregations. Now, of course, it's much safer to infiltrate a Catholic congregation than it is to infiltrate a terrorist cell. So, you can see why they prefer that work. But it is, I hope they're thinking that. But the question is, have they shown a great capacity to learn? And the answer to that, I think, is it's not obvious.
Well, let's talk about the learning. This was John Kirby, spokesman John Kirby, speaking to, I think it was CNN earlier today.
Our Israeli counterparts just a day or so ago said the same thing that we're saying.
Yes.
But we haven't seen any direct evidence that Iran participated in these particular attacks. Now, we do know, of course, there's a degree of complicity here, Poppy, because they've been supporting Hamas for years. Tools, training, resourcing, certainly rhetorical support in just the last 24 hours. But no specific evidence that they were participating in this, resourcing this, planning these series of attacks.
The Wall Street Journal said that Iran Hamas said Iran participated. What the hell kind of statement is this?
Well, the problem is they really don't want to do anything about this. And if you admit that Iran took part of this, was behind it, there's a lot of pressure to do something. This administration has, for reasons that I suspect are actually pretty corrupt and are certainly idiotic at best, has pursued a bunch of deals with Iran, which all look like terrible deals for us, even if they happen. And they've been willing to give the Iranians literally pallet loads of cash and all kinds of other goodies to try to get these. So to admit now that Iran is behind this horrific, not just mass murder, but as you say, mutilation, decapitation, torture on citizens of an ally with a lot of relatives in the United States, I should add, is really unwelcome for them. And they're going to do everything they can to not have to respond to it.
Glenn Reynolds is his name. You find his work over at instapundit.com, professor of law at the University of Tennessee. And I appreciate you taking the time to be with us, Glenn. And that piece is over there at the New York Post. And the reason that I wanted to engage, and certainly my respect for Glenn Reynolds is incredibly high, is that we've had this conversation. You've had it in your own life, and we've had it in multiple places where we see that the agency class in the United States is not actually focused on what it is the agency is supposed to be doing. Rather, they're focused on everything else. If the CDC can then tell us that, well, guns are a threat to national security and safety, and so we have to do something about guns via the Centers for Disease Control, you realize that they believe they can do anything. And what we've created in the United States is this completely unaccountable group, this fourth branch of government, the agency class, that isn't responsible to us, that isn't accountable to us. They have a budget that is near unlimited. They say something, it has the full effect of law. It is a complete bypassing of Congress. Now, in a standard world, in a normal world, in a thinking world, what you would have is rules and regulations, thoughts and philosophies that actually make things better. But if, as Glenn points out in this piece that you can find over there at the New York Post, if we're engaged in mission creep, how does one focus on what the mission is? And if we're talking about the very critical things about safety and security, but instead the FBI wants to go about surveilling Trump supporters for 2024, or as Glenn points out, going after churches, then how could you possibly keep an eye on the person who wants to set the church on fire? We hear about this in the most immediate way of what value is the terror watch list when we see somebody commit an act of terrorism who was on the terror watch list. And the answer is there is no purpose to it. Who watches the watch list, and what happens to these people when something happens? No FBI member gets fired. No one on this organization gets fired, or in this agency gets fired. No one ever loses their job for it. No one ever suffers the consequences of their failure. But somehow we're supposed to be rest assured or feel secure because a watch list exists. We can only feel secure if the job is done. How Israel didn't do their job is beyond understanding. And if it's this idea of Mossad focused on these judicial reforms as opposed to the enemy, that's a whole nother conversation. Was Israel complacent? We've got a fence and we've got an Iron Dome. We're fine. No, the enemy doesn't think that. You get lulled into it. The enemy still hates you. This is a huge warning for the United States, and we should be very focused on it. My thanks to Glenn Reynolds. My thanks to you. And of course, as always, my thanks to my sponsor, Americans for Prosperity, AmericansForProsperity.org, economic liberty, free speech. That is where it's at. I'm in favor of both things, people. Always have been, always will be. I'll catch you next time. Take care.